Hey, John, thanks so much for speaking to me this morning. We're going to have a series of conversations, a short series of conversations about adaptive leadership. Thanks for coming and doing that with me. And I guess let's get straight to the point of what is adaptive leadership? How does it differ from, say, a non-adaptive style of leadership?
Thanks, you. Super excited. As you know, I love this topic. We've talked about it quite a bit. So, what is adaptive leadership? I think of it as a collective term or for the skills that enable people to first spot the need to adapt and then to mobilize people to figure out how to adapt and then to make that change happen. So I guess it's a collective term for where you see really effective actions in response to the need to adapt in an environment.
So we're responding to our environment, getting a good sense of what that environment is, and there are challenges in that environment. And am I right in thinking these aren't necessarily technical challenges or problems for an expert to fix?
So you talked about what's the difference between, so if you go back to there's a couple of really influential thinkers or writers in the space. One of them, Ronald Heifman, Harvard professor. He made the distinction between two types of language. So just sort of understanding, I guess, some of the words used. And as he would talk about a technical challenge versus an adaptive challenge, or a technical problem and an adaptive problem. And I think the distinction is quite useful, though it's jargon. Technical being a problem you have where we have known expertise on how to solve that, where we have that expertise within the organization and we can apply that expertise to the problem. Okay, so it might be where you're having a sort of failure of execution, but it's on a known strategy, and that could be just as something as simple as we're launching a new product that's not going that well, but it's a problem we've solved many times before. You bring some expertise in and you work through that. What he talks about as an adaptive challenge is where our current strategies are not solving the problem, or we don't understand the problem, and it requires us to fundamentally shift or change something in the organization. So, that might be, to use a similar example, it might be launching a product, but into a really, really different market. So where our approach to doing that normally just is falling flat. And we have to figure out something new. The key being, and we don't know what works. We don't know
Right.
what works. That's the key distinction.
Right. So there's a fundamental uncertainty there into how to address that challenge
Yeah,
and how to change in a way that's going to best fit the
yeah.
solution for that.
And
I get
he
it.
would talk about the most common. We'll come back to traps later on, but he would talk
Mhm.
about the most common trap is responding to an adaptive challenge as though it's something where you have known expertise, and using the kind of that leadership style of just being authoritative and trying to uh, impose a strategy on something, irrespective of whether it's working.
Got it.
Um, and the simplest analogy I'd give for that I think most of us can relate to, well, no, not most of us, anyone who's a sports fan,
Hmm.
which is me, um, the frustration of watching a team you're just impassioned with continuing to use a strategy that is clearly not working and just stubbornly sort of going on, and you're just screaming as a fan going, this is not working, try something different, is what we mean by that kind of approaching it and ignoring the fact that there's a need to adapt.
So I think we'll come on to this aspect as well, just to give a foretaste of it, that it's about experimentation and trying new things out
Yeah.
and not just resting on the ways that you've always done it before for the sake
Yeah,
of it.
just to back that up, I think if you, I guess when you're quite new to this topic and just trying to get a feel on what's at the heart of it, I think that's, for me, if you put it in one sentence, what adaptive leadership is about is this idea of, um, we'll come back to this probably, but having humility enough to know that we don't know what works. So how we respond to that is to try a lot of stuff
Mhm.
really quickly, really low cost to figure out what works. And then once you've figured out what works, actually you go back to very traditional leadership of really disciplined action. How do we scale that?
Mm, I get it. So we're talking now about adaptive leadership, and you've been in the leadership space for many years as a thought leader. And I want to know why. I know, I know your own humility and modesty comes in to challenge that statement, but I do hold to it. Why is adaptive leadership becoming more relevant now for the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, it's really when we were having our pre-chat, Hugh, we were kind of bouncing this around, and I think in my writing I'd fallen into the trap of saying this is something all very new, and we suddenly need to pay attention to it. I think it's always been relevant, actually. You've What I found myself going back to thinking about is every period of history where you've had a lot of disruptive change, there have been organizations which have managed to adapt. Some have managed to adapt, very impressive when they have. And I think there's a lot of learning around that. There's probably been more organizations that haven't. So
Hmm.
anytime you get this period of highly disruptive change, there'll be organizations that fail to adapt, will either become irrelevant or die, or certainly become less relevant and certainly become less prominent. You know, they can
Hmm.
bounce back, but they'll become less prominent. And then I think critically, this is very similar to nature actually,
Hmm.
where there are organizations that don't adapt and become less relevant or die, that creates an opportunity for new organizations to grow up, which have a DNA that is perfectly matched to the current environment. So new organizations will emerge. Um, Coming back to your question of why now, I think few people would deny we are living through uh, an awful lot of disruptive change, and it feels like multiple waves of that coming from. I know they're somewhat interlinked, but also distinct, right? So you've got climate change, you've got, I think when you stop to think about it, the world is still kind of recovering from a financial hit in 2008 and then COVID. So you've got certainly from the sort of, public funding and tax and resourcefulness in the economy, we're still recovering from that. And then you have just the massive disruption, slow build disruption, but the massive disruption coming quite fast of AI and technological shift. Um,
Am I still allowed to use the word VUCA, John? It's a word that I've heard you use a lot. We might need to unpack that for a world that's volatile and uncertain.
yeah.
Yeah. Are we still talking about VUCA, or does this move the conversation forward somewhat?
So it's a good question for me personally. I think I'm quite attached to it because I found VUCA just a useful frame to kind of just describe what we're talking about with a really unpredictable, chaotic environment happening at once, right? So,
Hmm.
I mean, I think there are a number of different terms being used. They all sort of describing something very similar. But if you look at VUCA in terms of volatile, unpredictable, complex, ambiguous, right?
Hmm.
Um, I, and then if you look at just something that is still in most people's minds is a really good example of that is what was that 12 months, 18 months, 2 years around COVID like?
Hmm.
VUCA is just a good description of that amount of change hitting very, very suddenly.
Yeah.
I think as we've spent time over the last few years trying to understand adaptive leadership and learning and get ahead of the curve of that, I think VUCA puts a particular focus on the sudden change that
Hmm.
smacks you in the face. I love the Mike Tyson quote about strategy that everyone has a plan until you punch them in the face. So VUCA captures this essence of something happening very sudden, but what I think is important to note about that is it demands our attention. In some ways, that helps our response. It's still quite challenging to respond to that. Some organizations did that better than others. But I might say something like climate change is even more difficult
Mm.
too, because it's that slow burn, easy to ignore. So you don't have enough urgency and you squander the opportunity to change early enough.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't think VUCA captures that. So I think, what am I saying, Hugh? I think adaptive leadership is broader than VUCA. I think
Yeah.
VUCA is one model or concept or idea that fits within understanding adaptive leadership. But adaptive leadership in its essence is, I keep coming back to, can we spot the need to adapt?
Hmm.
Secondly, going back to your point about experimentation, do we then have a really good methodology around working out what will work and being humble enough to recognize that requires a lot of test and learn, fast cycle, test and learn. And then I
Mhm.
think the third element, once you've figured out what works, can we then mobilize the organization, lead change in
Mhm.
order to be able to put that in place quickly?
Great. And I'm interested in exploring each of those themes in our subsequent conversations. Just to wrap this short conversation up, I wondered if you could give some examples of organizations that are doing it, that have learned to adapt or are applying adaptive leadership techniques in some way. What are they doing that's impressed you?
Yeah, so I think what would I look for? I would look for organizations that have got their radar switched on. So any organization that's doing a lot of data analytics and using that data and asking the question, what is this telling us, and responding to it, or putting a lot of energy into creating a culture which encourages people to challenge the status quo and so I think organizations that have their radar on, and there's some quite known organizations like, if you look at Netflix has been very good at adapting, um, and I would say Amazon as well, but those are two organizations that are very tuned into using data analytics
Mhm.
to spot quickly how the world is shifting, and then so they will, if there's a shift in the market, they will capture that probably before their competitors were. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing I would see from organizations that really impress me in this is organizations that get this idea of test and learn.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a crazy example. And actually, they get a lot of criticism from this within the fan base. Um, World Rugby, just to take a sporting
Mhm.
example, is constantly trialing new approaches and new rules. But the way they do it is they will test a new rule in a very lower league competition. So the consequences of that getting that wrong are really contained. They can learn a lot, and then once they've proven whether that works, they'll then So I don't know. Just to give a real example of that, as they've put in more regulations around safety, around head injuries, you've got this more red cards. As fans, we've noticed that that's really disrupting the sport because
Mhm.
you lose a player for the whole game, that really disrupts the game. So they've been playing with different versions of that, right? But they didn't just go straight to, we know what works, let's implement this on the
Mhm.
world stage. They've tested a load of different iterations and small competitions to figure out what works. And I've certainly seen one approach work really well, and I'm keen for them now to scale that. But
Mm.
that's once they've done the testing.
Is it an example? And forgive me if this isn't your example, but I hear you talking about cannonballs and bullets. Is it one of those examples that I know you really,
I,
you're
I,
not a big
I
fan
love
of
the analogy.
cannonballs or
So
bullets?
so I mentioned Ronald Heisen. There's another
Oh, sorry,
really
John, you give me a great opportunity just to correct ourselves there. Is it
okay.
Ronald Heifetz? Yeah, and
Thank you,
his
thank you,
colleagues. Yeah.
thank you. The other source that I found a really rich sort of seam of insight around this was a piece of research done by Jim Collins.
Mhm.
So people will know him, probably the most will know him for the book he wrote on Good to Great. But he I'd say wrote another book, but actually what's key is he did a 8-year research project before that book around looking at organizations who were effective at adapting. So who had been in a really, really challenging environment, such as the airline industry, and had massively outperformed both the stock market and their peers through a
Mhm.
really disruptive period of time. He uses this analogy around the mindset of experimentation. I know it's not his, but I love it, of an older Navy analogy of, if you're low on resource, right? So
Mhm.
cannonballs are a really key resource, right? You don't want to waste them on an uncertain bet. So what
Mhm.
they used to do in the Navy is they would fire bullets, or more technically, I guess they'd be firing musket balls
Mhm.
in order to get range. So if cannonballs are about a big bet, you would talk about calibrated cannonballs and
Mhm.
uncalibrated. Calibrated cannonballs are where we've tested it, we know the wind, we know it works, okay, and we haven't, we're not wasting resource. We know it's going to work. What organizations I think do is jump straight to firing cannonballs
Hmm.
and waste resource, and they burn their resource. And then, if it doesn't work, it's kind of hard to pull out of that because they've invested so much in it. Whereas firing bullets, really easy to do. I think the equally interesting trap that he highlights is once you have calibrated what works, you have to fire cannonballs, right?
Hmm.
So this is interesting. It is experimentation is really critical, but it's critical until you figured out what works, then double down on it and really go into disciplined action, which is it.
So we're diagnosing something, as it were, and then we're taking action around that diagnosis or that range that we've found. We've then got to do something about it.
Well, I
And
pick up on you mentioned diagnosis, a really key concept.
mhm,
One of the traps is acting without diagnosis is about understanding what's going on. I
mhm,
still think that's different to experimentation, right?
okay.
So diagnosis figure out what it might be to figure out, okay, we notice demand for this product is going down. Do we
Mhm,
understand why? That's the
okay.
diagnosis.
Right, yeah, yeah.
But the experimenting would be, well, how do we address that?
Yeah.
And it if you have clarity around and you have proven experience of how to solve a problem, you don't need to do experimentation. Okay.
Mhm,
But it's recognizing, it's just having the humility to recognize, actually, we don't know. Let's, I don't know, if I give you an example, most people will relate to, actually, it's a really good example is, so most people know about the Chilean mining rescue.
mhm.
What people don't know, unless you really dig into it, is they had three drilling teams going, right? Um, all trying to get to the same destination, but using different approaches.
Right. So we remember the celebrations at the end when one had succeeded, but we're not seeing the test and learn
Yeah.
that's going on there behind the scenes.
But that was the genius of the project leader to go, actually, we've never done this. We've never gone through this, a mile of this rock as quickly as we need to. So we don't know what works. I'm not going to
Mhm,
bet on one. I've got enough resource to put three bets down, and we will keep trying different approaches
mhm.
in those.